Shadows follow their owners, but when Ethan noticed his shadow moving on its own, he realized he wasn't alone. Ethan had always been practical. He didn't believe in ghosts or omens, but when he moved into his new apartment, something felt off. It wasn't the creaky floors or the drafty windows. It was the way his shadow seemed wrong. At first, it was subtle, a flicker in the wrong direction, a lag when he moved. A trick of the light, he told himself. Then it started watching him. The apartment was a cheap find, a one-bedroom unit in a decaying building with flickering fluorescent hallway lights and an elevator that rattled like it might give out at any second. It wasn't much, but it was his. Ethan worked nights, which meant he often came home when the world was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that made you hear things you shouldn't. Phantom knocks, faint shuffling footsteps from the apartment above, even though no one lived there. He shrugged it off. The building was old. Old buildings made noise, but shadows didn't. One evening, as he passed by his hallway mirror, he noticed it. His shadow wasn't aligned with his body. It was slightly off-center, the head tilted at an unnatural angle. He froze, moved his hand. The shadow didn't move. It stood still, waiting. A deep unease settled into his stomach. He shook off the feeling and turned away. But in the back of his mind, something nagged at him. Shadows weren't supposed to wait. Ethan began testing it, turning sharply, waving, jumping. His shadow eventually followed, but there was always a delay. The first time it spoke, he thought he imagined it. It was late. The glow of his television flickered in the dim living room, casting long, stretching shapes across the walls. He was dozing off on the couch when he heard it. A whisper, so faint it could have been the wind through the cracks in the window frame, but it wasn't. "Why did you leave me?" His breath hitched in his throat. The room was empty. The television buzzed with the static of a dead channel. He grabbed the remote and switched it off, plunging the apartment into darkness. The whisper came again, this time closer. "Don't turn away." Ethan bolted upright, fumbling for the lamp. Light flooded the room, harsh and fluorescent. His pulse thundered in his ears. The shadow lay still, obedient against the wall. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the unease clung to him. Every movement felt watched. Every step echoed back to him with a fraction of a second's delay, like something was just barely out of sync with the world around him. That night, the air felt thick, oppressive. His shadow stretched longer than it should have. He turned the lights on and off repeatedly, watching it shrink and grow, but something was wrong. The edges weren't crisp. They bled into the darkness, shifting ever so slightly when he wasn't looking directly at them. Then the lights flickered, just once. When they came back on, his shadow was standing, not lying against the wall, not attached to his feet, standing, facing him. Ethan stumbled back, his pulse hammering in his ears. The shadow didn't move, didn't sway like a natural cast of his body. It was still, too still, like it was waiting for something. The light flickered again. The shadow took a step forward. Ethan lunged for the light switch and slammed it up and down. The bulb sputtered, struggled, then flared to life. Blinding, pure white. The shadow was gone, but something else had changed. His reflection in the hallway mirror wasn't facing the right direction. It stood slightly turned, looking just past him. He turned sharply to check behind him. Nothing. When he looked back at the mirror, his reflection had returned to normal. Ethan didn't sleep for days. Every shadow seemed darker, stretched longer. The fluorescent lights in the hallway outside his door dimmed every time he walked past, like the electricity itself was afraid to illuminate him. Then one night, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. No message, just a blank notification. He ignored it. Minutes later, another. And another. The fourth one contained a single word. Look. The screen of his phone dimmed suddenly, the reflection showing only his silhouette. Only, there were two. One was taller. He spun around. Nothing. Just his apartment, empty and silent. But in the reflection of his darkened phone screen, the second shadow smiled. His breath came in ragged gasps. He grabbed his coat and rushed to the door, wrenching it open, only to find the hallway lights flickering wildly, the walls stretched long and distorting. It was like a bad VHS tape, glitching, skipping frames. The air felt wrong, heavy with something unseen pressing against his chest. The door slammed shut behind him. When he turned, his shadow was still inside the apartment, staring at him through the peephole. The world wavered. The floor beneath his feet wasn't solid anymore. It was like he was stepping into a place that wasn't quite real. He reached for the doorknob, but his fingers passed through it. His shadow, his own shadow, pressed its hand against the peephole from the other side, the shape distorting as if trying to push its way through. The last thing he heard was his own voice, whispered from the other side of the door. "You left me behind." The apartment was found empty, his keys, phone, and wallet untouched on the kitchen counter. Only one thing was missing: his shadow. And if you stand in that apartment at night, sometimes you'll see it, waiting for someone new. Some things are meant to stay attached. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. But always make sure your shadow moves when you do.